Welcome everybody to this, our latest in the series of Meet the Makers. Today we're focusing on documentary filmmaking, the art of telling true stories on screen. Documentary filmmaking is a booming genre, with streaming services like Netflix reporting some of their highest viewing figures from documentaries. And with so many media outlets now, there's a huge hunger for real-life storytelling. On television, as well as feature documentaries, which you might go and see at the cinema whenever those open. Today, we are absolutely delighted to be joined by Marina Parker. She's a multi-BAFTA-winning documentary director and producer. Her films have been broadcast by the BBC and tell the stories of, among others, females fighting ISIS, death row inmates in the USA, body dysmorphia, and the first film to use remotely operated cameras inside a British court, that being the murder trial. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome to this Meet the Maker session, Marina Parker.
Hi, James.
Hello, Marina. Hi. Thank you so much for joining us, Marina. So let's start with right now, because for someone like you, who's a documentary filmmaker, you specialize in telling real life, is this bizarre chapter of life that we're all living through at the moment, is this kind of grist to the mill? Is this inspirational good news for a documentary filmmaker in some strange way? Or are you in lockdown like everybody else and can't get out there?
Most people I know have been, documentary makers have been totally locked down and unable to leave the house. And unless you had a press card, it was quite hard to move around London because the police were saying, what are you doing? You know, you shouldn't be out and about. So I think about 90% of all BBC production stopped. But I was lucky enough to pitch a film that got commissioned. So I started filming a couple of weeks into lockdown. So
and is it about lockdown?
It is about lockdown. It was a bit overwhelming trying to get my head around the hugeness of Corona. So I decided to go extremely narrow and choose one street and film that street over a year and see how people's lives were changed.
Wow, that's great. So that's what you're spending a lot of time going back to the same street and interviewing people over a long.
It had to be very close to home because you couldn't go to the loo when I first started filming. So you had to come home to be able to go to the loo and eat and go back out again.
So is it your street?
It's not my street. I think that would have been too close to home for all sorts of ethical reasons I'm sure we'll come back to. But no, sufficiently far away that I would never sort of bump into people on a regular basis, but close enough to be able to go to the loo was the very logistical choice. Plus an interesting street, and a street that would tell you something about, you know, the country rather than, you know.
Well, I love to hear these stories because we're always talking to our students about, you know, so much of filmmaking is logistical. I mean, you know, it's this extraordinary, it's art, it's technology, it's logistics, it's this wonderful interplay between all those things. So I love stories about toilets because so much of my life as a producer is exactly that. It's like, well, where do we go to the toilet? So, you know, it's important that young people hear this stuff. There are so many types of documentaries, I suppose, because a lot of young people might have seen stuff on streaming services mainly, because obviously younger audiences are drifting traditionally away from some of the places like the BBC or ITV, and they would have seen documentaries short or long form. But they probably aren't aware that, as I understand it, and I love documentaries, by the way, I've always adored them, that there's kind of lots of different styles, aren't there? There's almost lots of different mini-genres within the genre of documentary. Could you sort of talk us through some of the big ones and sort of where do you think your work sits in that?
So yes, you're right. TV is obviously a huge industry and factual is a big chunk of that. And then within factual, there are different strands. So you've got, if you think about it sort of as a commissioning point of view, you've got science, history, arts, which are all different departments within the BBC, current affairs, investigative journalism, and I live within the documentary part of BBC, and I do a certain kind of filmmaking, which we call observed filmmaking. So it means that you don't have a script. So in lots of areas of documentary, let's say you're making a film about history or geography, you would do lots of research before you set out to shoot a single frame. So you'd lots of research, you'd write your script, and then you'd go out and shoot to that script. And your shoot might be 2 weeks or 3 weeks, or if it's natural history, it'll be several months. The way I often work is the complete opposite, that I will go out somewhere to an interesting place and then sort of, or an interesting person, and then spend a lot of time there and see what comes out of that encounter, that precinct. So it could be a hospital, could be a courtroom, could be, you know, with a great surgeon, could be, I don't know, somebody's trip across a country, and see what unfolds, and from that carve your story.
Mm. But I suppose that the problem with that, isn't it? It's from a commissioning point of view, and that's why. So a commissioner, well, could you just describe what is a commissioner? How does that? What is their role?
So the process of the way the TV documentary industry works is that people take ideas to the channel, and that would normally be production companies. So they pitch ideas to channels, and then you get commissioned by BBC One, BBC Two, Three, Four, Netflix, etc., Vice. There are all sorts of platforms, and then you get given the money to make the film. And I suppose where you're going is that it's very unknown, and it's
because you can't take a script to them and say, I mean, they're literally, you're taking. So what are you taking to them at that stage?
You might take a 5-minute thing that you filmed with the main character that you think is a good character. It might be so brilliant that they just can't miss it. You know, if it's absolutely delectable, you know, if you've got a film about Meghan Markle, they would commission it blind, you know, off the bat. If it was a film about a great surgeon, you know, you might just have a little 3-minute interview with him in his office, and they think, oh, he's a great character, you know, let's go with him. So yeah, and how experienced you are and how well known you are, less and less is required of you as a sort of concept.
Because a lot of our students rightly point out, and it's this sort of, it's a really difficult thing, isn't it? That the more experienced you are and the greater your track record of success, the less you need help to get stuff done. But actually the easier it is to get stuff done, because, you know, someone like yourself with your track record, you walk in and you say, I've done X, Y, Z, they know you already. And so you pitch an idea that if someone who is, you know, fresh out, 22, 23, came in with that idea, they might do an amazing job, but who knows? And so it's difficult, isn't it, to sort of, you've got to do it backwards.
Yes, it's true. I mean, what happens is as you get more experience, you take on, in a sense, riskier and riskier projects, because you become less risk to the channel. So then they can put riskier things with you. So, for example, when we filmed in the courtroom in Scotland, that was a hugely risky project, because it took us 2 years to get permission to film inside the courtroom. And all this time, Channel 4 were pumping in money, and then they pumped in money for a 2-year production. And that's a big gamble for a channel to take, and they could take no risk that we would make any mistakes, because the access was so sort of tentative and political, and a lot of people had to agree to that film to be made, both prosecution, defense, the defendant, the victim's family. We needed 360 degrees of consent to make it. So for Channel 4, that was a big gamble. So in a sense, you're right, but the stakes go up for everybody as you get more experienced, in a sense.
Now we've mentioned, let's stay on that, because I mean, that was a fascinating project, wasn't it? The murder trial. And that was fairly early in your career, am I right?
It was, when was it? 2014. So yeah, about 6 years ago.
And talk us through that, because this was the first time cameras had been allowed inside, because in America, they film everything. But in the UK, we have closed access. You're not allowed to film in courtrooms. So what was the idea of this project, and sort of how did it come about?
Well, that was exactly our selling point to the Scottish legal system, which was that everybody's idea of court and courtrooms and justice comes from American drama. And, you know, we have quite a distinctive legal system in this country, and Scotland has its own legal system, and they're very proud of that. So the other argument we made was that part of justice is it being seen to be done. And so that we were making an argument that nobody really knows what goes on inside courtrooms, because who's been inside a courtroom, who's watched a trial from start to finish, that it was something that would be in their interests to allow. And the law moves very slowly, so that's why it took so long for them to consider our request. And in the end, they sort of granted us a 2-year window in which we could apply for permission to film trials. So we would, every week I would get sent all the indictments for all the, you know, every single case that was coming up that week in court, hundreds of documents. I would categorize them all. Then I'd look for the most interesting. We always went for the murders, actually. We didn't, the financial fraud, you know, was sort of wasn't going to entertain people. So we were looking for a trial that was going to engage people, entertain people. And that's, again, sort of an ethical area that you sort of think about why you're doing and what you're choosing. But we wanted something that was going to grab people and then show off the work of the legal system. And so we found this trial that was, it was the trial of a man accused of murdering his wife. And it was a huge case in Scotland. And so we filmed that 6-week trial, everything that happened inside the courtroom. We weren't in the courtroom, we had these cameras that were remotely operated. And the whole trial occurred just like normal, and no one was aware they were being filmed. And what we agreed with the court was that after the trial was finished, we would get in contact with everybody to ask their permission to see if we could use what we had filmed inside court. So justice wasn't sort of interrupted in the process, and afterwards we made the film.
Oh, wow. So, I mean, that's an example, isn't it, of sort of, I suppose, all the technology of that is, it just comes from whatever the idea is. So you're having to, every time you start a new project, the technical concerns just stem very much from what you're trying to do. And that could be vastly different wherever in the world you are and whatever you're trying to do, I suppose.
I think that's interesting that you say that, because often new technology will invite you to be able to go into new places that you would have not been able to previously go. Whether it's cameras that operate in, you know, crazy temperatures, or, you know, underwater cameras that can go deep into the ocean. You know, it just invites different ways to make films. And actually, you know, digital filming has changed the film industry, the TV documentary industry hugely, because it allows you to shoot for many hours in a way that before we had digital cameras, we were shooting on real film, and that was very expensive. And so for a documentarian, you made very different choices about how and when to film.
That is so interesting. I hadn't considered that at all, but of course, and also the immediate playback, the ability to sort of check on the time rather than send off. This is, you know, we talk to our students about celluloid, you know, and a lot of them nowadays sort of go, what's that? You know, no one's ever, they've never held the real sort of film stuff. They've only grown up with digital, but it had to be sent away, processed. So you never got to see, and I hadn't considered, I mean, I started my film career on film, and so, but for documentaries, that must have been a nightmare, yeah. Wow.
Well, in a way, what you did in those days was that you were editing as you were shooting. So you were making a lot of choices whilst filming, whereas now a lot of those decisions and choices come much later in the edit. You know, you just shoot because you can. And then when you get to the edit, now, when my grandfather died, I went through all his old archives and found this old celluloid film. And when we watched it, you know, it was very little of it, but he'd made so many choices that it was almost like a cut film in a sense. You know, he'd thought about every frame that he'd shot, because, you know, he had 12-minute little rolls and that was it. Whereas I could shoot for, you know, hours and hours and hours and hours. And then I have the same nightmare that he had, but in the edit.
Yeah, well, actually, I love, this is a really important point, because again, our young filmmakers, when they first come, they have a slight mentality, this is within fiction, not documentary, but that they can go out, shoot lots and lots, and then fix it in the edit. And what they find is they get into the edit and they're simply overwhelmed by the volume, because of course you have to watch it real time. So if you shoot 3 hours of footage, it takes you 3 hours just to watch it. By that point, they're bored stiff anyway. So we are really trying to get them to do what we do in the industry, to plan meticulously beforehand. So to give us some idea, I mean, on a documentary, how many hours might you shoot in toto that your poor editor has to wade through?
So it really varies on the project. So obviously on the murder trial, we shot 6 weeks. I think we had 8 cameras that were shooting 8 hours a day. So that's a lot of footage.
48 hours a day times by 6 weeks.
Yes, so we already made a decision, because we had a live gallery. So we had live editors working that we're doing some cutting there. So I would take it in turns with the person I was working with, Nick, and we would sit next to the edit, and we would cut from camera to camera. So we'd say camera E, camera A, do a pull on D, come out on C. So we were live cutting in a way. So we were making some decisions, but there was still a lot of decisions to be made further down.
1,000 hours of footage later, yeah. Wow. Just, you know, the amount to watch 1,000 hours back takes you however many, a working day of 8 hours times. I mean, it's just mind-boggling, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, it's interesting what you said about the different kind of skills are needed, but being organized is one of them, and and handling your material, get a handle on your material, and really think through the systems that you've got to set up, and how you're going to view the footage, and then how you're going to hold that footage in your head. So, you know, a lot of time is spent before you start an edit of thinking that through, talking through with your editor, the workflow, and that will be particular to every project.
Wow. We'll come back to editing, I think, a little bit later as well. So I think what I'd love to do is show a little bit of something. Now, I think one of your latest films was this incredible story. The title is Anna, the Woman Who Went to Fight ISIS. We'll watch a little clip from it. Maybe we'll do that first, actually, and sort of then, and then we can talk about the genesis of that project. So let's take a look at a couple of minutes from Anna, the woman who went to fight ISIS now.
Dirk is following in Anna's footsteps, flying to Iraq and travelling across land to the Tigris River that borders Syria.
It's amazing to be travelling through this extraordinary landscape. Anna had to cross the Tigris secretly. She had to cross at night.
By joining a foreign militia, Anna ran the risk of being prosecuted as a terrorist upon her return to the UK. The journey was dangerous. She crossed the border in a small boat with other internationals.
International volunteers usually bring far too much stuff. Particularly American volunteers will turn up with all sorts of stuff that they try and get through customs, kind of telescopic sights and thermal scopes and body armor and whatnot. The European ones find it harder to get a hold of military kit, so we just turn up with unnecessary camping gear. Whereas the Kurdish fighters are running around with a kind of piece of naan and a grenade, you know, very fast guerrilla fighters.
When Anna arrived in Rojava, she was placed in a YPJ commune to learn Kurdish and begin her training. Whilst there, she was filmed by a documentary maker. This is the first time this footage has been seen.
I suppose, yeah, maybe I'll say a bit about why I decided to come here. I never thought that I could be someone who could participate in the revolution here. I want to know that it's real. As anarchists, we're always told, oh, you're just idealists, you know, you're naive, that could never happen, that could never work. Yeah, I feel like this is really important and amazing, and I'm going to learn a lot, and I don't regret it for a second.
Great, so fascinating clip. So can you just give us a little background to that particular film? What is the story that you were telling there?
So Anna Campbell was a young woman, aged 23, from Lewis, and she got herself to Syria to fight with the Kurds, who with a sort of, I mean, it's a complex piece of geography and political history, but the Kurds are fighting against ISIS in northern Syria, and they're also fighting for their own homeland. And the Kurds have long been a sort of resistance movement that young people from around the world have been joining to fight with, because they sort of believe in the Kurdish right to a homeland. So the sort of extraordinary thing was that this young white woman who had no connection to the Middle East whatsoever got herself to Syria by herself. And she was there for about 9 months before she was tragically killed by a bomb, which the Turkish dropped on Syria. And so my film was the story of her father going out to Syria to, in one way, try to bring her body home that was still in Syria, but at the same time to try and understand why she had gone and to make sense of the choices that she had made.
Certainly. And what I suppose this leads me on to sort of, obviously you get choices of what stories you want to tell and work on. So how, for this particular film, sort of where did the story come to you, and why did you choose it versus another?
So I was approached by the BBC for this film, and it's not really my natural sort of area to do films about, so it's geopolitics. I'm not hugely worldly in that sense. So I was slightly sort of nervous about that in one sense. But then when I sort of looking into it, I realized it wasn't really about the Kurds or Syria. In fact, it was just really about being a father and being a parent, and about when to let your children be free. And that really resonated. And I think that's all you really, you know, as you get more experience, you go down the line, what you get better and better at is knowing when something touches you or something is of interest, and you're just waiting for that feeling that this means something to me. And that's the one you go after. So I'm offered lots of things, luckily, and then every so often something will sort of register, and I'll think, yeah, I'd like to know more about those people or them.
And so I'm wondering about stakes because, you know, obviously a lot of your films are very high stakes sort of stuff. I mean, we talk about stakes in fiction filmmaking, about sort of, you know, what happens if it doesn't go well type thing. And a lot of yours are about life and death and the really big questions. Is that something that's conscious for you?
You mean as in high stakes, as in whether or not they're going to come off as films, or that the subject matter is quite serious?
Subject matter feels big, you know, there's always big stuff. I looked at your, you know, your track record. Are you conscious of that, or are you aware you're drawn to those?
I think I come from a very sort of middle class family, and there wasn't sort of huge emotional range at home. You know, we were all quite contained and well behaved. And I think I've been drawn to subjects or people or situations which allow me to explore some of the more extreme sort of parts of human experience. It's a way to explore your own, you know, in a way that my childhood didn't allow.
Yeah. And let's break some of these down into, because we love at Young Film Academy to get practical. So you know, documentary crews, obviously, the joy of them to some extent is, you know, I would imagine smaller is better to some degree. So can you, for let's say the Anna, the woman who went to fight ISIS, give us some idea of how many, how big, you know, what are they carrying, and sort of, and how long are you out there, and what are you doing when you're out there?
So you're right. You want to try and always, my rule will be to be as small and as light as possible. And there's loads of reasons for that. One is, the most important is just the way you move through these spaces that are not your spaces, whether it's a hospital, somebody's house. I mean, just imagine it in your own life. Like if you open the front door at 7 a.m. to a film crew, would you rather it was 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, 6 people? I mean, ideally it'd be 1 person, you know, but you sort of build up from there. So you want to be light because it's you want to be light on your feet. It's cheaper, so then you can put your money into longer shoots, nicer cameras, you know, longer edits, because you get sort of pot of money. So it's really how you distribute that pot. So yeah, small crew is ideal, and you want to go for the sort of nicest camera possible given the scenario that you're in. So on that, so how do I make that choice? Again, it's the type of person that you're going to work with. So you want to, I mean, for me, that's very, very important. It's a personality thing. You're going to pick a cameraman. So on that, so I would take a cameraman with me. I would do sound. That would be my basic crew, just 2 of us. Now, because it was Syria, I had to have 2 fixers, a driver, and like a security guy from England who's ex-SAS to come with me. So that for me was hugely cumbersome, and I felt like I was dragging around like weight that I didn't really want, you know.
But it's still life, which by fiction filmmaking is micro.
Yes, but it's sort of, you're trying to catch a butterfly, which is real life. So, and you haven't got actors who are all showing up ready to work and saying, what do you want from us? You've got real people who are nervous, uncertain, you know, unwilling in some ways, potentially. So yeah, so you're just trying to not spoil this thing that is real life, I suppose.
Yeah, and so it's, I mean, fascinating that therefore the art of directing, because you directed that film, didn't you?
Yeah.
So you are both directing and sound recording. So you're there on set, you've got headphones on, you've got either a boom or you're trying to put a radio mic on someone, you've got a separate recorder here, so you're concentrating on levels, and you're having to do the actual bit of like live directing as it's happening. But obviously it's very different from a fiction film where sort of a director sitting back in a chair somewhere with a screen saying, do it again, do it again.
Yes.
Can you talk to us, what is that process of directing within that live environment?
So yes, the relationship between you and your cameraman, in the case of me that doesn't film, I mean, sometimes I do film and then it would be my sound person. That relationship is a real ballet where you really have to know, the better you know each other, the better it is, because you sort of anticipate what the other one does. And I often work with the same team again and again and again, because they will know what I'm interested in and what I'm trying to get. And so, you know, if it's something that you're really, that's really unplanned, I don't know, like you arrive somewhere and you start shooting, you know, my cameraman will know exactly what I'm interested in. And so we don't really have to talk much. You know, we'll both know that's interesting, that's important. And I would get out of the way. If I'm not, so there's different types of scenarios. So one scenario is where I'm just filming something that's actually happening, like a family having lunch together. So I would just stay really out of the way. I'd set up the sound so that I could be away from what's happening. And he would shoot, and I would say, let's shoot out of picture, out of everybody's way, and just capture something that's real. And, you know, we want to not try and change what's happening here. If it's an interview, it's obviously very different. It's an encounter with me and the contributor. And again, you know, your cameraman will probably start filming before the contributor knows that you're filming, because those bits when people are caught unawares is often the most magical bits. And all of that requires like trust and communication between you and your cameraman. But my sound can be a bit shonky sometimes, because you can't do everything beautifully all the time.
Because so there was, you know, Nick Broomfield, famous documentary maker, he used to trademark in, essentially because he walked in holding all the sound equipment, people sort of thought he was the techie, and so they underestimated him, which allowed him to get a whole different set of responses than if he sort of walked in with a suit and said, hello, I'm the director type thing. Like, do you use that in any way or play in that, or is there a shtick that you do that, you know?
I think that you really have to be yourself. People smell inauthenticity, you know, so quickly. And if you sort of put on a different accent or pretended to not be from where you were from, I think people would know that. So there's something about being very open-hearted, really honest, as transparent as you can be. And that's a bit of an art, you know, how and when you reveal yourself and your intentions to the subjects of your films is a bit of a, you know, a ballet in a way. You don't always come on day one saying everything about what you plan for the film, but you always have to be honest. So I guess, you know, and if I'm shonky with the sound, that is genuine, and maybe it puts people at their ease because they think, oh, she's not a big slick Emily Maitlis operator, you know.
Does Emily Maitlis do sound?
I don't know, maybe not, but you know, I don't look so polished.
And just whilst we're on because I want to just talk a little bit about the human skills that are involved here, because obviously they're very different, but just technically, so you said you do shoot yourself and have that, because obviously at Young Film Academy, we're very passionate about getting females into the film industry, and not just in the traditional kind of soft skills roles, but really in technical departments and camera and sound and all those wonderful things. So how did that come about for you? How did you get those skills?
Well, I went from working on 2 feature films for a director who made documentaries. So that when I didn't want to work in feature films. I always wanted to work in documentary, but she's a director who moves between genres very, very fluidly, which has always appealed to me as well. But she then said to me, this director, I want to make a film about homelessness, and that's going to require, so here's a good example, that's going to require us to need to shoot over a long period of time. We're going to shoot for 8 months. So to make her budget last, she needed someone young and cheap, me, to shoot it for her, because a DOP would have been too expensive. So I became, you know, the cheap option, and then I needed to train myself to be able to operate a camera. So I did a 1-week camera course, and it was really rudimentary, but it's all I needed. I needed to just know how to turn it on, you know, iris, shutter speed, just the basics, basically, just about how to operate the camera and to think about shot sizes, so that you could, so that you'd know to cut a sequence, you'd need an establishing shot, you'd need, you know, single shots of the 2 people that were talking, and
cutaways.
But I suppose that was the basic, and then from there, I learned a sort of particular way of filming, which was really filming with your ears and listening to what people are saying, and then going with your instincts about what's interesting, which is what observational filmmaking is. It's you in the moment knowing what's interesting and where you want to be, and having the technical skills to be able to get there. It doesn't necessarily need to look like a feature film or something incredibly beautiful. It's your capacity to get in the room that in a way is going to serve you better than your capacity to shoot. That's the thing that's being tested.
Wow, that's so interesting. And I think that's really inspiring for young filmmakers, because actually the thing young filmmakers often don't have is lots of swanky equipment and big crews and all those things. So weirdly enough, making documentaries as your starting point, if you're an aspiring filmmaker who's listening to this, is great, because you've only got yourself or your mate. Perfect. That's an ideal scenario. You know, and actually a lot of very available equipment that people have, an iPhone or a tablet or something, would be fine to start off making a documentary, because the important thing is the story, the access, and it's less about the polished slickness. Is that fair?
100%. And actually, I think people, you know, have come to accept all sort of all forms of media, in a way, people are very democratic about what they expect. And if it's something that's difficult to film, if it's some undercover filming, you know, we all expect it to look, you know, terrible. And if you're filming somebody giving birth, you know, you don't expect it to look beautiful. You know, it's going to look, you know, difficult, and that might add some charm to it. So I think documentary is a brilliant thing for people who don't have access to huge resources. And actually, what I would say this is that I've got a lot of, you know, I know a lot of people who've moved from documentaries to feature films, but I'm not sure that people can go back so easily. If you make feature films, the unpredictability of documentary and the uncertainty is very, you know, frightening for people who control everything.
That's so interesting. And so we're going to open up to questions, guys, by the way. So let's get your questions into Marina. Remember to put audio at the end if you would like to ask Marina your question yourself, and we will just simply unmute your microphone. We can get to do that. So please do send in your questions. Marina, just coming back to the logistics. So you've got the 5 of you. You're in Syria, and you were there for weeks on end. Is that right? So I'm just trying to. I think what I'm asking is the lifestyle, if you like, because previous speakers on this series have talked about. Let's say last week we talked to one of the makeup department on Star Wars, and they were talking about 3 a.m. call times and 10 p.m. finishes, and, you know, exhausting schedules, and how it just subsumed their life for 5 years. What's that like in your world?
So yes, again, with observational filmmaking, it means that you are at the mercy of your film and your subjects, and it can be that can often mean that you have to be entirely available to the film whenever it's needed. And depending on the project, so the murder trial, I lived in Scotland for 2 years, so that was quite a big life change. And every film has, you know, every film until the last couple of years has required me to go and live for 6 months in the city that I was filming in. So I lived in Margate for 6 months, Oxford for 6 months, Birmingham, Cambridge. Then Scotland was probably the big one, the big 2-year one. And as I got more senior and I sort of decided I wanted to have more of a life, I've taken films where the shoots got shorter and that I would only shoot for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks away. I mean, the Death Row films, actually, that was 9 weeks. That was 9 weeks living in the US. So that's quite a long trip to be away. And when you're on the trip, you're entirely at the, we took 1 day off, I think, in 9 weeks. So we worked constantly, and we worked late nights, and which is crazy because it's 1 hour of television in the end. And the murder trial was 90 minutes, and that was 2 years of my life for 90 minutes. So yes, I sympathize with your empathize with your Star Wars makeup. You start at whatever time is required. You often need to get dawn shots. You'll need to get sunsets. You know. Do you do that willingly, or is it inspiring? So you want to get out there, or is it easy to drudge at times? Good question. I think if what you're shooting is good, it's very energizing, and you feel excited, and there's nothing like the feeling of shooting stuff when you know it's going to be in the film. And you just have a feeling every time I know that's going to be that'll be in there, and that's a wonderful feeling. It's the sweet spot. It really is the sweet spot. Sitting down with somebody where you think, oh, this guy is never going to make it. I've got a 2.5 hour interview. You know, that can be less exciting.
Do you do that sometimes? Do you just cut the interview short? You know, you've programmed an hour interview and you just realise there's nothing coming, and it's equivalent of a bad date where you just get out of it quickly.
I would bring it down to an hour. I would never end an interview then and there. And it's not often that you can't find something, but there are it's occasionally that you think, oh, this is going to be hard work. It's going to be swimming through treacle for both of us.
Okay, so we've got some questions coming in for you, Marina. So we've got Sophia Emmett, and welcome, Sophia. Lovely to have you back. Sophia's been on lots of these before and always asked brilliant questions. So Sophia asks, did any subjects you did at school help you with documentary filmmaking?
I don't think anything directly helps. As in, I never did anything that was directly linked to sort of the craft of documentaries, but I think I did English A-level and I did English at university, and in a way it's all about story. I mean, that's such an obvious thing to say, but story is that's your currency, that's what you're building, that's what you're looking for. And as you get more refined, you start to recognize beginning, middle and ends. You start to recognize jeopardy in real life. And I suppose that probably has its origins in English for me, and just, you know, reading
I think that's such a good point, because actually people might think that a documentary that doesn't have a script doesn't have a structure in the same way that a narrative script does. But my understanding is that you guys you're finding exactly the kind of structure that we want from a fiction film in real life, but you're having to sort of build the bridge as you walk over the ravine type thing.
Completely. I mean, and at the beginning you really don't, I mean, because I didn't do any formal training apart from my week camera course, I discovered that in the edit. That was, my edits were my training ground. In a way, they were my film school, because then you really sort of lived through the lack of what it was that you needed, whether it's jeopardy or stakes, or, you know, characters that you really cared about, or watching change happen. You know, what you really, I suppose it could be simply said that, like, nothing is what it seems, and that's what a story is. And it's sort of fundamental, isn't it? That you start off showing you something and then it turns out to be something entirely different. Say with the Anna film, you think it's a film about a young girl going to Syria, but actually it's about what it is to be a father.
So it's storytelling, really. And that's the skill. Yeah, I think that's great, because that for whatever you do in life, Sophia, storytelling will serve you well. So get that English literature down you, or any literature in any language. Okay, so this next question is from Hannah, who is 20, from Suffolk. And Hannah asks, how do you find unusual stories like the one about Anna? Do people send you ideas that you can then take forward to the TV channels? So I suppose this is kind of like, are you looking at the newspaper and thinking, oh, that was interesting, or how are you finding your material?
That's a good question, Hannah. Yes, all of those things. You sort of read the newspaper carefully. I did a lot of work on a film that we got from the Metro on the Free London newspaper. There was a story about a young boy who was on trial for murdering his stepfather in Guildford, and that was the beginning of something that became a drama on BBC One that I worked on. That just came from the newspaper. Sometimes, I mean, these days it mostly comes from people offering me things. There's something I'm working on at the moment that I'm doing myself, but it's sort of, it can be quite expensive. You might need to travel to do research for your film idea if it's a foreign story. So yeah, most of the time it gets offered to me.
Yeah, but I suppose looking at someone who was looking to break in, the point is that
definitely comb through newspapers. If you hear of a brilliant, you know, I don't know, garden centre where lots of, you know, I don't know, something unusual that's close to you, or something that you think, you know, would be of interest that nobody else could get to.
It's local, I suppose, isn't it? Especially now, but actually local stories, you often hear about things in your local area that are actually fascinating. And
yes, well, the street that I chose, for example, that's an example of me pitching it myself, actually. So that, yeah.
But I think the other thing to say about this, the fact you're doing it about a street, and for our young filmmakers out there, is that a lot of young filmmakers might go, oh, that documentary about the guy who works in my garden centre, for your example, is too small. They would think that, you know, it's not big, it isn't about life and death, but actually isn't that part of the skill, is finding small and then finding the universal? Is that something that...
I would 100%, for me, like all the universe is in like the smallest speck of dirt. And there's a film I made about body dysmorphia, which is just one girl going through a year of treatment, and we only really filmed in the therapy room. So it was just the same place every week that I go back to. So it was a tiny story, but in the end it felt quite big. I mean, I did lots of things to try and make it feel bigger than that in the end. But yes, you could make a film about your street. There might be all sorts of interesting gates, you know, every couple of weeks. How are you doing? What's going on? What's happened? You know, how's your life changed through Corona? What is this making you think differently about in the world? You basically get to be nosy, you know, for a living. It's a brilliant job.
Okay, this is a next question from another one of our wonderful regulars. This is Octavia Sanger, and hopefully we're going to be able to hear from Octavia herself so she can ask her question. So Octavia, we can hear you. Go ahead and ask your question.
How did you get into the film industry? Like, where did you start and how did you get to where you are?
Hi, Octavia. So I was living in Argentina when I left, after I left university, and a friend of mine made a documentary. She'd gone to film school, and she made a film and I helped her with that. And I really loved it. I loved the process. She actually, sorry, what was that?
It's a student film at this stage.
Yeah, it was a student film. We didn't know what we were doing really. I mean, she knew much more than me. She was probably like one of your alumni. So she knew much more than me. And I was just going to help her out basically, and watching what she did. She filmed me basically traveling around Argentina and meeting people. And then she took 6 months to cut it. Every weekend we'd sit in her sort of bedroom and edit. And I thought that this is brilliant. And then I moved back to England. On the back of that, I thought, I know what it is I want to do, and I want to work in documentary. So I moved back to England, and I then got a job on a film set as a runner, working in costume. But for this director, who was a documentary director, and I had my eyes on her, I thought, I want to make films like you, and I'd like to work for you. So I'd made a beeline for her.
And I suppose so. And then talk us through. So you got on the costume of that, and then where did you go from there?
So basically, I came back to England. I went to a talk that she's called Penny Wilcock, and she was a brilliant documentary maker, absolutely brilliant, and probably the person that's inspired me most. She's very sort of amazing woman, and like I said, moves from opera to drama to fiction to sculpture to all the medium. She doesn't see any difference really between them. But so she was doing a talk at the Riverside Studios, and I went there and I hung around afterwards, overheard her giving her email address to somebody in the bar, wrote it down, emailed her the next day and said, we sort of met last night. I'd love to work for you. And she said, well, I don't have anything, but I am doing a film. Maybe you could see if you could volunteer on the film set. And so I went to meet the producer, and she said, well, I probably could pay you 200 quid a month or something, and you could work in the costume department. We're looking for people. So I went as a costume standby, which means that you hold the umbrella and you hold the coat for the actors, and then you run in between takes. And I worked really hard, and I made sure, it was amazing. It was just an amazing experience. And at the end, she said, I notice you're always attentive, you're always on it. Why don't you come and be my researcher on the next project? And then I was away. And then sort of 2 projects in was the homeless film, which she then said, you're going to need to learn to shoot to be able to do it. And I did my week's course.
And that was with Penny Wilcock,
Penny Wilcock, exactly.
That's such a great story, because I think that, for a lot of young people out there, they will be thinking what they're taking from that is that you hadn't attended a film school, you hadn't done lots of technical training, that there seems like there was a real determination and a will to find a way, because we always talk about there's no one set way, you just got to find a way and keep at it and be dogged. And you identified someone you could genuinely want to work with and do almost anything to work with. And then when you had your opportunity, you worked incredibly hard, proved yourself, even in a role holding an umbrella, and here you are now. I think that's an amazing story, and hopefully really inspiring for a lot of young people out there. Okay, so we have another question here. This is from Samantha, who is 17 from Manchester. And Samantha asks, what happens in terms of getting the final okay from people when you're producing a documentary on them? Are they able to watch the final programme before it's aired? Great question, Samantha.
Brilliant question, Samantha, yes. All women so far, all girls, I've noticed. So that's a really, really important part of it. And depending on the project, we have, it's called, it's the process of consent and how people are going to give their consent to be in the film. And so I would almost always have like a 2-stage process. So people will agree to film, and then agree to broadcast would be something further down the line. So in the murder trial, obviously we filmed everybody, and then it was only afterwards that they consented. So that was a big gap. And I did a film in Adam Brooks when people were in comas. So we were filming people when they were unconscious. So that was a whole other consent process involving their families, and we would start filming in A&E. So people would arrive, and we were filming them arriving before even their family knew that they had been involved in an accident. So that was, again, a more complicated consent process. But the answer to your question is that I would always show families before the film goes out, the whole film, and always go to their house and sit with them and watch it together. And I mean, in all the years that I've worked, nobody's ever asked for a film to be changed or for anything to be taken out. And even though I've done films where, you're filming different people on different sides of a trial, or in the case of Death Row, people you know, the victim's family or the perpetrator's family. So you're representing all sides of a very, very conflicted, difficult situation. If you haven't got an axe to grind and you're trying to tell the truth of everybody's truth, then people will almost always be, you know, recognize that truth and be okay with it. But yes, I would always give people the chance to respond. And sometimes it can take people a couple of days because it can be emotional, or, you know, they might be worried about something. But it's a very slow and gentle process because, as you say, the stakes are always high in these kind of things.
Wow. Although I can imagine someone who felt, there must be cases of people who feel that they have not come off well, who would want, essentially, when they went, they might have agreed to film, but they wouldn't agree to broadcast. Like, what does one do in that circumstance? I know it sounds like you've never faced it, but I mean,
I had one surgeon in Great Ormond Street who cried in the documentary. One of his patients, who he'd died, didn't recover from the operation, and when I did my interview with him after this child had died, he cried, and he said, "I really am not comfortable with being seen to cry." And I said, you know, I think actually you'll find that people will be so moved by the fact that you cared that much, because doctors don't show that kind of emotion. It's very rare that you see a doctor sort of reveal how he really truly feels about something. So actually people are going to be very moved by this, and I want you to trust me that you're not going to regret that. And he did. So he went with that. I mean, often you can explain what it is that they're worried about. People often worried about eating, that they don't look nice when they're eating. People might worry about, you know, they look fat or something. And you say, if people are thinking about how big you look, then I haven't done a good enough job, you know, because they shouldn't have a chance to. That was with body dysmorphia, where I was dealing with somebody who had incredible anxiety about the way she looked. So that was another whole, you know, complexity.
so actually, it's the people skills of what you do. I mean, is extraordinary. That must be. And you don't go into documentaries unless you are equipped with some of these amazing emotional, sensitive skills, because, you know, you're doing exactly the kind of things you're describing.
I think it's a job for people who, if you're really nosy and you like people and you want to know what makes people tick and why they do what they do and how they came to be themselves, you know, if you've got a real curiosity for people, it's a brilliant job, because you're made already. I mean, that's just that you're sort of 50% there in a way, because you know the questions to ask people, what makes them tick, what makes them who they are. And it's probably like psychotherapy in a way. It's like being a psychotherapist, but with a camera. That's how I see it.
Okay, we have a question from Mikhail, who's 19, from Stana, who says, how much can you make up and still be a documentary filmmaker? I'm thinking of making up dialogue for people or reconstructing, in inverted commas, what happened in the past.
So that's a really good question, Mikhail, because I sort of, as a matter of course, just wouldn't ask people to repeat things or to say things again or to have a conversation where I script it in a way. And I think some people test that. There's a sort of ethics around this about what you'll ask people to say and do for you. And you can see it sometimes when you watch documentaries. You can see people, you know, somebody's got the perfect lens for a shot and you think there's no way that you could have known that was the lens you needed for that shot. There had to be some direction to get your contributor to do that. And that's a sliding scale. And I really rarely ask people to do things. It doesn't sit well with me at all. But if you're asking about sort of reconstruction, like drama recon, that's a whole sort of other division. And then you use actors and all of that. I mean, you might ask people to, I'll often try and start a conversation between my subjects. You know, if I'm with a family, say I'm filming them at lunch, I might film them at lunch. And then after a while say, Susie, could you ask your mum about, what her childhood was like? And I might do that. And I would not, that's not asking people to say anything, but it's throwing a little spark into the conversation. Yeah. And then you step back and see what happens.
You lob in a grenade.
Exactly. It's brilliant.
Wow. Okay. This next question is from Wolf, who's 14, from Essex. And he says, does a documentary ever end up being different from what you first thought?
Yes, it does, Wolf. It always does. And in a way, it should. If it's exactly the thing that you imagined, probably something's gone wrong because you haven't allowed it to sort of breathe and be. So there's different you know, it's something when you sort of conceive of it and research it, and then it's something when you film it, which is something different to that, and then it's something different when you edit it. And in each of those processes, you work with somebody very closely who will, you know, help you develop what the film is. So at the beginning, you'll work with a researcher or a producer, and then in the middle bit, you'll work with a cameraman, and then at the last part, you'll work with an editor.
Or
and
woman.
Every time, sorry?
Or woman, or camera woman.
Or camera woman, sorry, cameraman, camera woman. I mean, I normally choose a man because they carry more stuff for me. But yeah, so it's a sort of, it's, you know, it's like you share this child, and the child goes from a baby to a child to a teenager with each of those, each of those relationships. And so it does change for sure.
And evolve. Great. This is from Hannah, who's 15, and she asks, have you ever felt really emotionally attached to your subjects? Would this make it more difficult, especially the life and death row subjects, knowing that they might and do die?
Yes, it did. Hannah, that was probably my hardest job. I made 2 films about death row, and one of them was a very painful process for me because I really liked the young man, and yeah, it took me to quite a difficult place because I didn't feel I could just be an observer. I really felt very drawn to get involved, and I had to fight that. And I was all the time trying to work out whether or not I should try and persuade this man. It was, to give you a bit of context, it was a film about a young man who was 21 when he was sent to death row, and he decided that he didn't want to challenge his conviction, that he wanted to speed it up and he wanted to die. And I really struggled, and I really wanted to persuade him to try and fight and to stick around for his children. And that's not really your job when you're telling somebody, you know, trying to be impartial and outside.
God, that must have been very, very tough. So this next question is from Kate, who's joining us from Los Angeles, age 19. And Kate says, have you ever started shooting and then given up as you can't see it turning into anything good? How long do you persevere for?
Once you've got a commission, you sort of have to give them something. So I will often think of, sort of in case of emergency, what is the bare minimum of a film that I could deliver in this subject? So I mean, projects have not worked out kind of in an honest way, and it's fallen apart. So a couple of projects ago, I did something which was about a huge New York sort of show, like a musical show, and the show was cancelled, and so the film ended. Filming ended, and it was done and dusted, but it wasn't sort of my choice to end it. It was beyond my control.
Got you. Okay, Jemima, 25. She's 25 from Wales. Asks and we sort of touched on this a bit before, but how much of the process is about people skills and making people feel comfortable?
So I should say this about documentaries, because when you're a director, you sort of make your crew up of what suits you best. So I love the people side, and I love the relationships, and that's the way I work, which means that I have somebody who does the filming, and I do the sound. I mean, sometimes I'll have a sound man as well, or a sound woman. And that allows me to have those relationships and for that intimacy to be in the film and to be able to get into really private places of people's lives. So there are other directors who might be more sort of photographically minded, and visuals is a big part of it. And then they would hire a producer who has those people skills and who would have the relationships with the subjects in the film. And that's a different setup. So it's not that you have to have them, or that's the only thing that can mean something to, there's lots of different sort of routes into documentary. I love the people side, and that's the bit that's been very natural to me from the beginning. And so for me, yeah.
Yeah, and putting people at ease, that must be a big part, right? I mean, because they must be scared. A lot of people are a bit terrified, you know, putting a camera in anyone's face, it sort of produces, and so much must be about getting rid of that barrier.
Yes, I mean, again, if you've ever had therapy or know anything about therapy, it's a similar thing. Like you're basically creating a space, which is a really beautiful thing. It's one of the beautiful things about filming is that cameras are not judgmental, you know, and actually when people are talking to a camera, they're able to say things that they wouldn't normally be able to say because you're just listening. It's just a sort of listening device, and you can sort of pour out your soul and you can say things, and it gives something an importance. It gives you a sort of arena of importance that you couldn't have otherwise. There are conversations that I have when I film them that you'd never have in normal life. It's the act of filming that gives them this sort of protection and this safety. So yes, you have to create that space. You have to know how to be able to take care of your contributors and know that that the channel isn't going to make the film into something that you don't want it to be, that other people are, that it's just that you are responsible for the thing that you're doing. And if people feel that, they'll feel safe, and they'll tell you things that I could never dreamt of.
Well, just a couple more questions before we wrap it up. So we have this question from Jonathan Aaron, who's 21 from Cardiff. And Jonathan asks, which I think is a brilliant question for someone starting out in this, is it possible to make a good documentary film about something I know nothing about?
Yes, it's the best place to start. Because in a way, knowing nothing means you've got a sort of totally blank mind. And so whatever you find interesting and is going to be your guide, because your audience knows nothing. So you, in a way, going to go through the process of discovering what's interesting about this subject, and then it should be interesting to your audience. Whereas if you know everything about something, then you probably find all sorts of sort of weird niche facts about it that are not interesting to anybody else. But all the stuff that was interesting at the beginning of the subject, you sort of, you got your head around months ago. So yeah, going in blank, starting from the beginning, and remembering what it is that interests you about the subject or the person or the place, keeping a note of that, because that's going to be when you come to the edit 3 months later or 3 years later, you're going to have forgotten what it was that first interested you about those subjects. And those are your sort of your signposts as to what is interesting, what's important.
Brilliant. So Jonathan, don't worry if you don't know.
Know nothing. That
is key. You'll be
and record your own reaction to things. That might be interesting in and of itself,
Yeah, and actually, you are therefore in fiction filmmaking, we just talk about the characters discovering the story at the same time as the audience. So I suppose that's the point about knowing nothing as you go into a topic, is that your journey of discovery. Whereas if you go in knowing everything, it's very difficult to take someone who knows nothing through that story with you.
Yeah. Exactly.
Fantastic. Well, guys, thank you so much for all of your questions out there. Some absolutely brilliant questions, and on such a wide-ranging career. And thank you, Marina, for all those amazing answers. So just at the end of the session, what we like to do is to really focus in and be practical for young people who are listening, who are, let's say, somewhere between, let's say, sort of 14 to maybe 20, 21, 22. They're at the stage where they're thinking about what kind of choices they might be able to do, what possible attitudes they need to have. So I suppose if someone's listening to you going, I want to be Marina Parker in the future, I would love to be making these documentaries. I feel that, true storytelling is something I'd love to be doing. What kind of advice, however general or specific, would you be giving them?
I'd say watch a lot of documentaries, really, really immerse yourself in that world, all types of documentaries, and start sort of, so you really understand, start seeing the form and how people break it and play with it. And whenever you go for a job, people will always ask you what films have you been watching. And if you say that if you haven't watched a documentary for a month or two, then they just won't believe that you're passionate about documentaries. So watch documentaries. I think people talk about finding your voice, and that can be quite difficult in a way because it requires real confidence, which is to know your own reaction to things. And that's something you start to cultivate when you're young, which is just to observe your observations of life, because that's what a documentary is in the end. It's a collection of your impressions, your choices, what meant something to you. That's all quite sort of vague in a way in terms of practical advice, but I guess these days learning to shoot is a really useful skill, and it probably will get you jobs in the beginning. And start humble, I'd say. I mean, for me, working for somebody who was brilliant, was who I really admired, was my training. I learned a lot from that, and that was because I was prepared to do a humble job at the beginning and just be close to something really interesting, rather than go in and expect something, expect to be interested immediately. I just thought I want to go near somebody who I think is really talented and just be in that atmosphere and see what somebody who's really talented, what it is to be in their sphere, and what are they doing, how do they move through the world. And I watched Penny for 2 years, and I learnt so much from seeing how she navigated the worlds that she occupied. And so get yourself somewhere interesting if you can, in whatever way you can get there. Get yourself there, and be humble about that. And then when you smell a chance, whoosh, go for it.
I love it. I think that's a great bit of advice, especially, and I think it's something we've touched on before in the series, this idea of identifying a specific individual or company, maybe, who really is sort of like stuff that you could genuinely sort of be absolutely humble and get at their door and sort of go, look, if I was in any way involved with you, it would be a life experience, regardless of whether anything comes of it. And I think that enables you to make genuine statements about your intent and how much you want it, in a way that if you just sort of go, I want to vaguely get into this world, but I haven't identified any specific thing, you don't have that authenticity.
I think that's why it's really important to watch lots of documentaries, because you'll start to see the names of directors that you like. You know, everything's so available online now, but you can see where they, you know, you probably can see where they live, where they study, what other films they've made. And, you know, if you get an email from somebody saying, I really love your work, I've watched all your films, I think they're incredible, I would do anything, you know, to come and do some research for free, or, you know, whatever it is, can I be involved in some way in your film? I mean, you might get lots of no's, but you might get one yes. And or even if it's just, can I have a cup of tea with you? And, you know, I do that a lot with people. I have a lot of cups of tea, and I help a lot of young directors, you know, who are trying to navigate their way into broadcast TV. So because you know, you give the help that you wished you'd got, or that you were lucky enough to get, you know, you want to pass that on. So just keep knocking, because if you don't knock, the door won't open.
So identify who it is that you want to knock on the door of, and then actually don't knock on the actual door, please don't. But do everything else. So fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Marina, for sharing your wisdom and experience and your extraordinary career with us. It's been a real pleasure for me and for all our listeners out there. So thank you. Funds raised from this Q&A will be donated to a charity of Marina's choosing, which in this case is the K. Mason Foundation, which identifies promising young people from disadvantaged backgrounds and gives them a chance to change their own futures in South Africa and the world. So thank you, Marina, very much for making that possible.